In this movie, we're going to look at the Working with Formulas settings in the Advanced Options dialog box, beginning with the R1C1 style, where we can globally change how cells are referenced in our formulas and functions. We'll take a look at Formula Autocomplete and how it helps you build your formulas, especially when you're using table references. So we'll introduce tables, and when you're using pivot table references, and we're going to introduce pivot tables. So I've got a worksheet set up that has 4 areas that correspond to the options that we're going to be talking about that are numbered in cells with brown fill. And these options are located in the Excel Options dialog box, which we can get to by pressing Alt-F-T, going to the Formulas group, and the second block of options working with formulas. These are the default settings. R1C1 is not selected, the other 3 are. Before I show you what the R1C1 reference style is, I want to show you what it is not. I'm going to left-click OK. I've got a series of cells that are referencing cell C5. Pressing F2 to put a blue border around the referenced cell. F2 again. All of these formulas are exactly the same, equals C5. They're all referencing C5, so they all say equals C5. Going back to the Excel Options dialog box, Alt-F-T, Formulas, I'm going to now use the R1C1 reference style, which is row column, which may be a bit counterintuitive because when we talk about a cell and we talk about the cell's address, it's always column row, A7, D9, G14, etc. Left-clicking OK. I now have the R1C1 style. So what happened? My column headings now are not ABC, it's not alphabetic, they're numeric. And where my formula used to say equals C5, now it gives a relative reference to the cell being referenced and defines the position that cell is using the current cell as a starting point. So what do I mean by that? The R1C1 style says row -1, column 1. I'm in row 6. If I subtract 1, I'm in row 5, and I'm in column 2, and if I add 1, I'm in column 3. So the R1C1 style defines the reference cell in terms of its relative position to the cell containing the formula. Arrowing down, now I have R-1C, because we're going from row 6 to row 5, and we're not changing a column reference. Arrowing over once and down once, I now have R-1C-1, so I'm in row 6, -1 is 5, column 4, -1 is 3, and so on. I'm going to turn the R1C1 reference style off, Alt-F-T, left-clicking formulas, deselecting that box, so that we can look at the other 3 items within that group. Formula Autocomplete, use table names and formulas, and use get pivot data functions. I'm going to leave all of those things on, left-click OK, and we're going to take a look at Formula Autocomplete. In order to trigger Formula Autocomplete, we just need to put what's in cell F7 into a cell, which is an equal sign, and then follow that with any letter that corresponds to the name of a function, for instance, A, and I get a list of the functions that begin with the letter A. As I type more letters, that list shrinks to those functions that now begin with AC. There's 4 of them. There are several different ways to select the items on this list. I can arrow to it and then press Tab. I can left-click to select it and then press Tab, which is what I'm going to do. When you press Tab, it pulls the function into the cell and sets you up for defining the arguments for that function. I'm going to escape out of that because autocomplete, selecting G7, also helps when you're working with tables. Now, we haven't talked about tables yet. That's for another movie. But when you set up a table, Excel defines a range as an entity that has properties. And since it is a thing onto itself, we can reference that thing, the table, in a formula, which is what we've done. Equals sum table 1. And we're going to use autocomplete to establish that formula. But first, I'm going to press F2 to show you that the reference is the contents of the table that begins in J7 and scrolling down ends in M57. Scrolling back up, we're going to use autocomplete to build that function. So we already know we can press equal and any letter that corresponds to the name of a function, which we know we have a sum function. Press the tab key, and now, of course, autocomplete is setting us up to define the arguments. And the first argument that we're going to establish is the table. That's the reference. When I put T in there, I get a list of the functions that begin with the letter T, but I also get a list of tables that have been defined. And in this case, I accepted table 1, the default name that's assigned by Excel to a table, as the name for the table. I could actually have named it something else. I'm going to arrow down to table 1, press the tab key, close out the function with the parentheses, control enter, and I get the same result that's in G7. Autocomplete also helps working with tables because the table, in this case, has 4 columns. I'm going to arrow down to select H8 equal sum, tab, table, TAB, tab, and now I can enter a left bracket and Excel displays the names for the column headers, state, 2010, change, 2000, as well as giving me some other options. But in this case, I'm going to arrow down, select 2010, press the tab key, close the bracket, close the parentheses, control enter, and I get the same result that we had in H7. Now, we haven't talked about pivot tables yet. There's a whole series of movies that are on pivot tables. If you learn anything about Excel, learn pivot tables. You'll be glad that you did. We have a pivot table that's right above the active cell, Q14. In Q14, we have the get pivot data function, and I got that result by initiating a function or a formula with an equal sign, left-clicking in the pivot table, control enter, and I get the get pivot data function. So why is that good? I'm going to delete that and go back to cell Q14 where we have our get pivot data function and arrow down twice where we have a cell reference that's S7. It's the same data that's in Q14, but Q14 is using the get pivot data function. So what good is that? Well, when I select the pivot table, I get the field list. And again, this is going to be easy to do if you don't understand pivot tables. You will if you watch the movies on pivot tables. Left-click and grab the sum of 2010 and move it to the top of the list. Just by moving it up until you see a solid bar, which looks like it's going to insert 2010 into that location. And when I left-click, that's what it does. I'm going to click off the pivot table and get rid of the field list. And what happened? The get pivot data function still gives us the result that we needed into that cell, which is the grand total of the sum of 2010. But the cell reference is still referencing cell S7, which is what it was referencing before. So the get pivot data function allows you to make changes in your pivot table, and your reference to the specific data in your pivot table will be maintained. So that's working with formulas. We took a look at the R1C1 reference style. We also utilized formula autocomplete to populate a cell with a function. We also introduced tables, and we used formula autocomplete to reference a table in a function. And then we also referenced a table and a specific column within that table in a function using formula autocomplete. And we introduced pivot tables and the get pivot data function.